So, hello, my name is Adam Claridge Chang, a scientist and editor at the International Union of Scientists. And today we're thrilled to be joined by Tings Chak. Tings is a researcher and art director at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and a doctoral candidate at Tsinghua University in Beijing. Born in Hong Kong and raised in Canada, she works at the intersection of art and the social sciences, translating China's large-scale social experiments for Global South and international audiences. Tings, many thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much for having me, Adam.
So we're curious, how was the Tricontinental Institute formed and what are the organization's goals?
Yeah, absolutely. So around 10 years ago, in 2015, there was a meeting called the Dilemmas of Humanity, in which many large mass organizations from particularly the Global South gathered together in Brazil at the National School of the Landless Workers Movement, or known as the MST. And this hosted this Dilemmas of Humanity, as the title of the conference suggests, to try to understand what was the state of the global left, as we can call it. What were the problems that were facing the peoples of Latin America, Asia, and Africa? And what was the political process that needed to be created? And so from that process, something called the International People's Assembly was formed, which today includes hundreds of mass organizations and all the continents of the world. And one of the things that was discussed in that meeting was that there needs to be also a think tank, a research institute that is from the perspective of people's movements, that also produces knowledge for the movements themselves, so from and for these movements. So the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research was conceived to be such a research instrument. And so in the last 10 years, we've organized in different ways, but always closely aligning our research agenda with these mass organizations, for example, in Brazil, in Argentina, in South Africa, or India. In the last 2-3 years, we've been structuring it much more around a regional process. So one of the tasks I have now is helping coordinate the Asia regional work, which includes, of course, research and publications together with movements in Asia. But we also organize as a Pan-African research network, as well as in Nuestra America, or Our America, in the Americans continent. So basically, I think that's the origin of what Tricontinental seeks to do and what we've been doing for the last decade or so.
Wow, that's great. So Tricontinental is sort of the think tank and ideas incubator of the International People's Assembly. Is that more or
Yes, I
less?
think you can call it like that. And then what we've been trying to do is expand and actually build research capacities of movements themselves, and also do collaborations with different research institutions that are interested in a progressive or left or even socialist agenda.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to see an organization that's oriented along the three continents, right? So Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And so talk about publishing the English edition or translation of Wenhua Zongheng, which is a Chinese journal of political and cultural thought. And what makes this publication so unique in the landscape of cultural critique and political science?
So Wenhua Zongheng, and one of the reasons why we decide not to actually try to translate it in a literal way into English or other languages, is that I think it also engages with different epistemologies, different ways of seeing and thinking about the world. And so we decide to retain that original Chinese name. Literally means verticals and horizontals, but it has sort of references back to warring states and thinking about strategy and the first period where how to unify China. Anyways, there's lots of things embedded in this meaning. So we thought we would challenge our readers to try and test out their Mandarin. But anyway, this magazine is a very important one in China. It was a journal, actually, founded in 2008. The editor-in-chief of the Chinese magazine, Yang Ping, and he's a good friend of the Tricontinental. And at that period in the 2000s, there was a necessity to try to bring together different progressive voices and intellectuals in China to have a space of progressive debate. Of course, many people in the West will always say, oh, but there's no debate in China. And I think that's just shows a lot of the kind of, I don't know, ignorance or also misinformation that gets spread about China a lot. But this is an important space of progressive dialogue and debate where you brought together what were called the New Left intellectuals, or even people with more sort of liberal kind of ideologies, to even Confucian scholars, a kind of broad left progressive spectrum, to engage with questions about, what does building socialism mean with this deep market integration? Are there sort of other framings around democracy or serving the people that is not within a Western electoral model? Things I think we'll discuss more in this conversation. So 3 years ago, Tricontinental created a partnership with Wanhua Zonghang to create its international edition. So actually, in addition to English, we publish in Spanish and Portuguese, because as our name suggests, we really want to reach to global South audiences too. And for us, Latin America is an important one. And we really wanted to be able to be a kind of bridge to translate and bring, not just translate literally, right, but culturally translate some of the discussions or how China sees its own development, but also how it sees itself in the world in this rapidly changing political conjuncture. And we're trying to create a space where especially global South intellectuals can also engage. We often invite, for example, people from Africa or Latin America, Asia, to write editorial notes and responses to the Chinese thinkers. And we're hoping to continue building that bridge, which is absolutely necessary in this sort of new Cold War period we're seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've sort of been noticing that, I mean, they say that pretty much every academic in every department of economics in China is trained in, the Chicago School of Western economics. But then someone else said that, well, but there's also all these Marxist theorists who are, also have academic positions. So there's this strange coexistence of, Chicago economics and Marxist theory. And I think Wenhua Zongheng is kind of interesting in that it starts to sort of course, none of the Chinese Marxists write in English or publish in English, or certainly not in Western journals, at least. So it's kind of interesting that we have a window into how Chinese academics and intellectuals see the way that China's doing things politically.
No, I think that's an important point because, we like to say in Tricontinental, we're engaged in the battle of ideas. And I think this is a very active battle of ideas. And just as you said, it translates in the into intellectual field. And we saw the opening up reform was not just an economic opening up reform, it also entered the ideological realm. So all of these things are being played out also in this battle of ideas. And we're trying to at least bring a different perspective, for those scholars who don't write in English, as you say, you don't publish in English or other non-Chinese languages. How do we also kind of amplify those voices and bring them into dialogue, not just those who have maybe studied in the Western institutions and have access to those spaces.
Right. And would tend to have more Western ways of thinking
Absolutely.
In general. Yeah. So, many scientists around the world might equate one-party rule with authoritarianism. However, some have described China as a consultative democracy where a lot of debate and deliberation occurs within the party and also outside the party. How would you characterize the political system in China? Is China a democracy, actually?
Yeah, I think this is a big question and an important one. I think it's at the crux of, how we understand just, the emergence of different civilizations, different nation states, and the coexistence of different political systems, right? I think one of the things to understand, you mentioned the Communist Party, to just give a sense of scale, last year, the Communist Party of China surpassed 100 million members. So to give a sense, if it was a country, it would be the 16th largest country in the world by population. So it's a very large institution. But of course, the country has 1.4 billion people. It's a large sector, but it's not, not every single Chinese person is a Communist Party member, of course. But even from it, the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, look at the PRC flag. You have the big star and the 4 stars. The big star was always represented the leadership of the CPC, the Communist Party of China, and the different classes within that of Chinese society, which actually includes the national bourgeoisie, which is interesting. It was never just like, workers and peasants aligning and under the Communist Party, but it's also the direction, of the party of the different sectors of society, which includes also the bourgeoisie. That being said, I think, how do we answer the question of democracy? I think right now the sort of hegemonic Western understanding of democracy is something around, electoral, a sort of liberal electoral democracy, right? You have multiple parties where you can elect every 4 or 5 or maybe 6 years. And if you don't have that process, then it's not democratic. It's somehow an authoritarian state. And I think that's just not a useful and way too simplistic understanding. And that's not even going into the crisis of electoral politics that we're seeing all across the Western capitalist world. Are these multiple party or 2-party systems really any more democratic than, say, countries that don't have that? That being said, maybe how can we understand China's system? And of course, the consultation is an important aspect. It's not only sort of enshrined in the structures. We're just coming up to the what's called the 2 sessions period, which is an annual political moment every year where you have both the legislative sort of bodies come together as well as the consultative body come together to discuss the main issues and strategies for the year. But I'll give you an example how consultation works. It can, for example, the Civil Code was created in 2020, so 5 years ago, and it was also brought into the spaces such as the 2 sessions to discuss. Before the Civil Code was actually put into law, there were over 10 rounds of mass public consultation, and this can take on various different ways, like through the actual structures themselves, but also oftentimes in these open and now increasingly online platforms where you can solicit comments on drafts of a civil code, for example. So for the civil code, it received over 1 million comments from almost 500,000 people on the drafts that get released in the years prior to actually adopting. And so when we actually see different sections and the modifications during those consultative processes, there's actually a direct response on issues such as this. Of course, there are other kinds of methods where you can see people's will or people's concerns being addressed. And one of them is really quite interesting, is that increasingly you see social media playing an important role too. And of course, here people say, well, social media is just censorship, it's completely controlled, people don't have freedom of speech, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very interesting how, especially in the last 5-10 years, how much the government actually cares about public opinion that appears on social media. And I can give you cases, a few years ago in 2021, there was the huge floods of Henan. And in that period, there was a huge social media outcry, lots of people's personal videos and, being shared about how there was very inadequate warning systems, the subway tunnels where people got trapped, all kinds of things. And it basically led to a very swift government response where, investigations being launched into not only officials, but looking at infrastructure and where it needs to be improved, where different kinds of accountability sort of needs to be taken. And it comes from this sort of people's pressure. And I can give you many, many examples in recent years of how something like that you can also understand as a kind of, let's say, informal consultative process. But maybe the last thing I'll say on the democracy question is I thought it was quite interesting because I think probably about, I can't remember which month, but last year, one of the European think tanks, which is not necessarily very favorable to Chinese views, usually, they released a democracy perception index. I think they do it annually. And that was quite interesting. They interviewed thousands of people in China and many other countries to basically ask the people if they perceive their country to be democratic. And what they found is that, in China, you had something like over 80% of the respondents saying they believe that they live in a democratic country based on how they interpret democracy, as in, does the government serve the people and does the government generally, work towards meeting the needs of the people? And what we see, of course, is that U.S. compared to, China and many of the Western democracies actually performed much worse than China itself. So I think this is also an important thing. How do the Chinese people feel about the society they live in? Is it democratic in a broader understanding of a government serving the needs of the people. And in that sense, I would say if you stop any kind of Chinese person on the street, you would find that as a favorable answer. And that's through my own experience in living in China as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think back to, I think it was a Princeton study that showed there was essentially no correlation with voting preferences and political outcomes, right? So I guess elections are not neither necessary nor sufficient for democracy, perhaps, right? So it's not always that elections and democracy are synonymous.
And I think we see this increasingly so. This crisis is not just, the era of Trump or others, where are the people, the US people's opinions when, let's say, Trump decides to invade a country like Venezuela and kidnap its president? Is there any kind of participation? Or the other 7 countries that Trump has bombed in his first year back in office? I don't think so. And I don't think any of the voters actually voted for those invasions. And so this is also where we're seeing a huge crisis in the liberal electoral democracy that is touted as sort of the democratic model. So I think this is a time for sort of deep reflections of what kinds of political systems have a right to exist and what political systems actually deliver on certain needs that reflect everyday people's concerns.
And many people around the world view China's reform from the 1980s as resulting in an ultra-capitalist system. However, others view the current system, including the party itself, as socialism with Chinese characteristics. And how does one reconcile these two views of China, that it's both, highly capitalist and commercial, but also, claims to be socialist? So, I mean, is China socialist?
I mean, I think this is one of the core questions people often ask. I think it's probably next to, I think these are the questions we're trying to frame, democracy, authoritarianism, socialist or capitalist. And I would probably say something that we need to complexify these questions to get to something more substantive or help us in understanding China, which is a very, very complex society with its own problems and contradictions like any society has. But I think one first question to help us kind of navigate this is that, who holds state power? We were talking a little bit in the previous question around the Communist Party, this 100 million person organization that runs the country. Of course, it was formed as an entity of the working class, working class at that time, being defined as industrial workers, but also in alliance with the peasant masses. And I think that in terms of who its state power, the Communist Party enjoys a huge public support. I think is linked to that question previously around, do people see themselves living in a democracy in China? And yes, and next to that is also a huge support for the Communist Party and has huge legitimacy based on what it has been able to deliver, things like eradicating extreme poverty for a country of 1.4 billion people, et cetera, et cetera. There's many, many things. I think it's very interesting. Sometimes we hear, Western media headlines, this, the Communist Party will fall. People are going to, have a color revolution or something like this. It's just not true because, Chinese people are living the best 40 years I've lived in 4,000 years. And that's just, you can see from the countryside to the city. That being said, I think it's really important that there is the Communist Party leadership and legitimacy that runs the government. It's not just any kind of political party, and that's one thing. But I think a second question is also much more, let's say, materialist, or can you say Marxist analysis around the relations of production. Of course, opening a reform period really that began in the late 70s, but took off in the 80s and 90s. Confuse a lot of people on the left. Is this a restoration of capital because capitalist elements were being brought back and integrated into the society that had been largely sort of removed in the earlier Mao period? One of the things I think is really important to know that it wasn't this sort of shock therapy sort of strategy that we saw with the collapsing of the Soviet Union, but something very much more controlled, let's say. And one of the key principles of the opening reform is what's called grasp the big and let go of the small. What does that mean? It basically means that the state sector maintains firm control over strategic sectors which had never been privatized or open to private capital. And this is what areas? This is energy, this is finance, this is telecommunications, this is transportation infrastructure, heavy industries. This is what's called the commanding heights of the economy under the era of Mao, So you see that the major, strategic backbone is still very much the state-owned sectors. And these are very key to any country that is trying to maintain its national sovereignty. They never sold its state grid or Sinopec or PetroChina. All of these are state-owned institutions. What was called the non-strategic or the small, let go of the small, many of the consumer areas, some of the aspects of technology, especially to be able to learn from the West in sort of IT sectors that were very, very, 40 years ago was little to be spoken about. Now China is in this, competition on the highest advanced sectors, from AI to chip making to et cetera, et cetera. We can get into that. Maybe we don't have time right now, but so that being said, I think we have to understand where is it that private capital enters the Chinese society to be able to understand whether or not it is socialist or capitalist. So there are capitalist elements, doesn't make it a capitalist system, both from the question of who controls the state and the leadership of the CPC, but also which sectors. And I also want to just take us back to what is socialism. Socialism was always understood as a transitional process. It's not communism. Socialism is a transitional process. And even Marx and Engels, writing the Communist Manifesto, never told us how long this period of transition will take. In China, we're still understanding it to be the primary stage of socialism, not even socialism as a whole, but just the primary stage. And under the CPC's own sort of planning is that by 2049, which is 100 years since the founding of the PRC, we will leave this primary stage of socialism, but still socialism. That being said, this long period in which private and public capital coexist has always been part of socialism. Just because there are billionaires, just because there are capitalists, does not make the system itself a capitalist system. So I think that's where the Chinese a socialism with Chinese characteristics is important. And I just want to also say that this has its long roots, even back to the period of Mao. He talked early on in the 1950s about coexisting economies, the 5 economies that coexist. That includes, of course, the state-owned as the backbone, but then there's also elements where there is a private capitalist or state capitalist economy or individual economy or cooperative economy. So that just help us understand and complicate the idea of socialism or capitalism. I just don't think that's a very useful question, and it doesn't help us understand the nature of how the Communist Party or the government intervenes to guide the market elements. One of the articles, I don't think we'll be able to talk about it too much here, but if anyone is interested in reading, we published in Wenhua Zhonghang by an economist named Meng Jie. He is a political economist at Fudan University. He writes a fascinating article around how the new energy vehicle sector developed, and exactly how does the state come into what his concept is constructive markets. The state doesn't just regulate it, but actually constructs them for specific strategic objectives. For example, the NEV sector. And for anyone who's interested in that, because I know it's a very hot topic, I highly recommend reading that to have a more nuanced understanding of how the state engages in the market side of the Chinese economy.
Great. And so this sort of leads into this idea that some people think of socialism as a fixed ideological system, but articles in Wenhua Zhongheng describe Chinese socialism as a process of experimentation, learning from failure. Would you say that this is almost a defining characteristic of Chinese socialism, this empirical approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is especially I think for the International Union of Scientists. Of course, you are all representing scientists who are empiricists. You understand, the importance of testing theory through practice. I think it's very much this is a history of the People's Republic of China and socialist construction. I think Deng Xiaoping framed it as crossing the river, feeling the stones. Of course, a country of this, complexity, this civilization of 4,000 years, the amount of social, economic questions it had to face for a country so large, a territory so large, it requires experimentation. There is no sort of one guidebook that, says this is how you build socialism in this country. So I think this crossing the river, feeling the stones is by, kind of a summary of this sort of scientific empirical process. And I would say, clearly you mentioned the Wenhua Zongheng issue. The last, the two issues prior to the current one. The current one is on Trump 2.0. The previous one is on Chinese socialist experimentation. And there's a very interesting article by someone named Li Tuo that basically outlining this historical lineage of experimentation from, dating back to even the Paris Commune,
Right.
and how we see this in the Soviet Union, of course, under Lenin, and then how China has also learned through and to adapt to concrete conditions through experimentation. That being said, I think we see it in many different ways. For example, when the opening up reform period came in, it wasn't just like across the board, like we had mentioned before. It wasn't a shock therapy, but also, experimentation of things such as the special economic zones that were created, Shenzhen being the most famous one. It began in select coastal cities that had their specific geographic and historical and economic ties already. And only through creating these sort of zones, pilot testing, perhaps then testing in another nearby city or region before any kind of model might be expanded to other parts of the country. Similar, we'll see this in poverty alleviation methods. Different pathways are tested in specific locales, then evaluated, improved upon before applying to other places. And you see this across all of Chinese policy and implementation. Maybe we can get into some more specific details, but I'll just maybe end it there for this question.
Yeah, I guess the so I really like the idea of governance as an experimentation, as an empirical feedback loop. I guess the thing that I haven't read enough on, and maybe you can speak to it, is how do you so there's definitely the Marxist ideology, right, and the state saying we want to be socialist, but then there's all this experimentation. And how do you think? Do you have any thoughts on how they balance those two things, right? Because I mean, in science, there's no, I mean, I guess there's theories, right, and it's very hard to update a very well entrenched theory if there's conflicting evidence. But it's yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on how they balance the ideology and the experimentation?
Well, I mean, I think, let me see how I can answer that question. Very interestingly, so, the Chinese Communist Party has, over the last, 70 odd years now, since the 77 years now, since the PRC was formed, they create different guideposts to understand what is the main tasks. And under the framework of principal contradictions, of course, that comes from Mao, to understand that there are many contradictions in any period, there's many antagonisms in any period, but there's a principal contradiction, which is the focus, and that might determine how you organize your strategies, your policies, and et cetera. So that might be the ideology part. And so interestingly, over the last 77 years, there's been three different principal contradictions. Under Mao, it was the period of class struggle, basically, the period of seizing the land from the landlords and distributing land reform, et cetera. Deng Xiaoping period, it was a different period. The social gains have been made, huge improvements in, life expectancy, in education, and land reform was essentially complete. So you enter a period where you have to now massively develop productive forces because China was extremely poor still. And so you went to this period. And so there was understanding of, now is to rapidly expand, a kind of growth at all costs type of mentality. Enter Xi Jinping in 2012 as an official shift in the principal contradiction. Now it's not just about kind of growth at all costs. And they don't use these words, but it really is talking about addressing unequal and uneven development. This is questions around inequality. This is questions about East and West, rural, city. So I'm just saying that this is a kind of ideological framing that updates as the stage of development changes, and that will impact greatly on how the party will then implement its policies. And maybe, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one example of how the kind of broader ideological framing will then completely, changing that principal contradiction. You see huge direction, huge sort of focus on the eradication of extreme poverty and this massive redirection of resources, human resources, technological resources, financial resources from those more developed regions to the less developed regions to help address now this unequal and uneven development. So it won't be considered like, oh, there were all these mistakes in the past. Of course, there's lots of self-criticism and many things, but how do you now rechart a course based on the new evidence and the new, material conditions at play? And you see that all the time, this sort of updating, resetting of course, drawing back or expanding. And this is quite fascinating when we actually study Chinese policy in that way.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Thanks for that. So 15 years ago or around then, China had a severe air pollution and other forms of pollution, and there were reports, at least, of widespread environmental protests. But now China leads, for example, in decarbonization of the energy economy. And you co-edited a Wenhua Zongheng issue on environmental changes and the sort of the transformation that's happened. And how did addressing the crisis go from being, what at least in the West was reported as protest movement to becoming an official leadership position? And what does ecological civilization mean?
Yeah, big question. I mean, I actually lived in Beijing now, I think the first time I visited in Beijing was in 2005, probably in the period of basically the period of air apocalypse. That was the kind of word that was being used to describe the air pollution problem, right? And I myself, when I visited, I really thought, it was really bleak. It was really bleak. I didn't think there would be a good solution. I also believed that this was sort of the cost, sort of the ugly side of rapid economic, Chinese miracle, which is a word I really don't like. It's magical thinking. It's not at all, thinking about, the process of constructing socialism. That being said, so living in Beijing now, I've also had to unlearn all kinds of things around the, what I imagined was possible or not possible with the, kind of, let's say, state leadership. If the Chinese Communist Party wants to, enact, really take seriously environmental problem, and it does. It really does. So when you look back, the air pollution question, I think it was around 2014. Of course, already prior, when we had the Beijing Olympics, there were already some efforts being made to address this question. Of course, people were very cynical and saying, "Oh, this is just sort of decorative, try to make it look better, so receiving the tourists and don't lose face," that kind of thing. But where the air pollution improvements really began was when the war on pollution was made in 2014 under Li Qiang, and huge changes were brought under. Just to give you an example, in the last, from 2014 to 2022, so not even a decade, the improvements in air quality was basically equivalent of improvements in the US in over 40 years. The average life expectancy increased by 2.2 years for an average Chinese person, just because of the improvements in air quality. So in the sense of how do you respond to what might be protests, complaints, dissatisfaction with environmental problem, which was very real, comes with very, very swift and decisive government action. But I would say that the idea that there was already an environmental problem that already preceded that. There was a very important Minister of Environmental Protection, Pan Yue, already in the late 2000s was saying that China's development path was unsustainable, and that the question of the environment was going to have social and economic and also, impacts that would eventually impose limits. And so we also see this repeated then within sort of the CPC's own understandings. I remember in 2022, the last major CPC Congress, Xi Jinping said very similar things. He was talking about the imbalanced, uncoordinated, unsustainable growth, and really with a focus on this question of ecological civilization. This term ecological civilization then gets brought into the Chinese Constitution in 2018. And you then see this brought into a series of policies, not only around air pollution, but also restoration of many damaged areas, questions around desertification, questions about water quality. That's something that we published an article on in Huazhonghang on the Erhai Lake experience in Yunnan province. But then also creating massive campaigns, for example, on reforestation. In the last 20 years, China has actually planted 25% of the world's new forests or new green areas in the world. I mean, this is something that NASA has documented. You can visibly see the greening of the deserts and the greening of China. But next to that, of ecological civilization isn't just restoring, the damaged areas. It's also around how do you actually transition to a new energy economy, which is a big question. And so you start to see these huge investments, whether it's in wind, solar. Now China is a leader in all of these areas. Investments in, we mentioned constructive markets earlier with the new energy vehicles, but the creation of entire market ecosystem to be able to create both the supply and the demand on new energy vehicles. Living in a place like Beijing or Shanghai, it's a highly electrified city. All of the buses are electric. Probably half of the cars on the road now are electric. People always say when they visit China is that they don't even hear noise pollution anymore. They're worried that they get run over by a car because they're not used to the kind of silence that there is because of the electrification of the cities. And so maybe that was a sort of disorganized response to understanding how ecological civilization, translates from, a top level understanding over the last 15 years of the major contradictions that came with rapid economic expansion, also understanding that kind of growth model has its limits, and then how this gets enshrined into not only the Constitution, but other kinds of, policy-making bodies, and then translates to, okay, we have restoration, we have to have investments into this new energy economy that includes the technologies, includes creating the markets, creating the supply, and also the education of the public, to be able to actually want to transition. One of the things that's very interesting, if you go to some of the let's say lesser industrialized economies, for a while they had to be convinced that pollution does not mean economic growth. There were communities like, bring us pollution, because if you bring us pollution, that means there will be jobs, that means that there are factories. And trying to understand that actually there might be a way to actually skip past that stage and actually enter a new energy economy where what's been called the new quality productive forces, not just growth at all costs, can actually benefit the development of different regions. So anyways, that was a sort of not very organized thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, it's interesting you said that there was already, even in the early years, complaining from within the party, right? So it's almost like the party has so many people and so much diverse thinking that there's actually quite a lot of discussion inside the party. That party member you said, the party leader who was already complaining about pollution at the very beginning, right?
Actually, can I just say one thing? Maybe this story is interesting for you, since you mentioned the party, and because the fact is that, yes, the party is a huge organization, It means that everyone has a family member that is in the party. It's just there are many scientists that are party members, but they made me think of one particular scientist named Kong Hainan. And I think this might be an interesting story particular for this audience, is that I mentioned the Arhai Lake restoration example. So Kong Hainan really led that experience. He had studied in Japan, learned about all kinds of sort of lake restoration, the most advanced kinds of technologies. And then he was the one that led a team when the state council decided that this is a priority project and needs to create a pilot, like we were talking about earlier, to see how we can restore one of the largest freshwater lakes that was basically on the edge of absolute collapse. So he led these scientists, a team in 17 different units there to go study and understand. But it's also a very much engaged type of scientific research. You're going because they're also party members. They have a kind of political social responsibility. So they would go and really live and be amongst the residents, understand where are the sources of pollution, what are their lifestyles like, why is it that there's certain kind of fertilizers being used, where was the runoff really coming from, and then trying to really help create building consensus from below, because and the scientists really help lead that mission, as well as being party members. And so oftentimes that will be this case, okay, so they realize that one of the main pollution sources was the runoff from planting a certain type of garlic that is very special to the region, and it was on the edge of the lake, and then with the runoff, etc. And so how do you start convincing people that this is their livelihood, and that there's something wrong, let's say, in the production method? You go really door to door, you start leading by example, you start convincing your own family members first. This is the kind of expectation of party members leading the way, or often scientists. That being said, later on they created this system called the technology courtyards, science and technology courtyards, and it was a collaboration with China Agricultural University. They created these little, basically, research centers in the middle of these villages, where graduate students will go and they might spend 2 years at a time, and they really live and work amongst the peasant farmers to help develop different, perhaps bio inputs, perhaps natural fertilizers, or try to help resolve the material questions. But that comes with also building of consensus by being amongst the people. It's not this from above, parachuting in. And so I think that system now has also been applied across the country, of building these kind of scientific and technology courtyards. Not only professors, but also students get to go and engage in really real material problems and get out of, the classrooms and the laboratories. So I thought that might be an interesting example for those who want to read more about it. It's in an article we wrote about the Arhai Lake experience.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. It's very interesting. And I think very close to IUS's interests in terms of, environmental restoration. So many IUS members are refusing contracts with arms manufacturers and opposing, university military partnerships. And in China, like everywhere, there's dual use research and a military industrial sector, but China hasn't fought a war in decades. And so for scientists trying to oppose militarism, how does China connect with this? And does China's experience offer any lessons?
Yeah, I think this is the question of our times, right? Militarism and how to oppose, especially U.S. militarism in this period. I think it's important, to think about, have a historical lens too. I mean, just last year, it was the 80th anniversary of the World Anti-Fascist War, or the victory in the World Anti-Fascist War. Of course, oftentimes it's called Second World War, but I think that's sometimes a misnomer, because it only looks at the European front. It kind of frames that war from a Western lens already, and really neglects, the whole Asia front, or the contribution of the Soviet Union or China. 24 million Chinese people died resisting Japanese fascism and aggression, and the war wasn't 4 years. Didn't start when, the Nazis invaded Poland. It started in 1931 when Japan first, launches its first attack against China. It's a 14-year-long war. And so I'm giving that example because how China sees peace, peaceful coexistence, and the role of military as a defensive measure is very much informed by this history that's alive. There's no Chinese person that doesn't remember, even if they didn't live it, but through the families and everything, of what the costs of war, because the People's Republic of China emerges out of this period of war and devastation, already 100 years of imperialist occupation, but also specifically this period of fighting fascism, Japanese fascism. So this is also what shapes Chinese foreign policy since then. Shortly after, we know the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence that get enshrined in the Bandung Conference of 1955, which also marked an anniversary last year. Things such as peaceful coexistence, mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression. These have become principles not only of China's foreign policy, but many of the global South countries that came out, their independence and liberation struggles came out of, understanding of the cost of war and why it's important to defend national sovereignty and also maintain peaceful coexistence. And as you said, I think we see this in China's record, right? Basically hasn't fought a war in half a century. Engages with countries in many different ways, such as building infrastructure through Belt and Road Initiative or through different kinds of economic or political partnerships. But you don't see invasions or bombings or coups, regime changes. You don't see mass externalization of, say, foreign military bases around the world. It's not a projection. It's not a power projection. As much as the Western media likes to claim, it's not a projection of its own military power against the sovereignty of other countries. But at the same time, we are living in a very, very dangerous period, a period that, Tricontinental, we've been calling it as hyper-imperialism, a particular stage, a decadent stage of imperialism, where U.S. in its increasing or decreasing influence on the economic or production side, and even in some areas technological side and political morale in the world, it's increasingly relying on its main hegemonic arm of its power, which is militarism. In our study, we documented 902 U.S. military bases around the world. The actual global military spend that we can say is controlled by U.S. or U.S. interests is 75% of the global spend. The U.S. spends per capita military spending 21 times more than China. And anyways, we've seen, and we talked earlier, not only the bombing and the kidnapping of a president of a sovereign country and the first lady, but bombing of countries just left, right, and center. So I think in this moment, we have to be very, very alert on the question of really what is the military threat in this world, and undeniably it's U.S. militarism against the peoples of the world. And China will do everything, learning from its histories, to defend its territory, defend its people, and will invest in militarism to be able to defend that interest, knowing from the cost of it. And this is just something that I think even the average Chinese person knows and wants, from the government, and expects, because it's coming out from a very, very shameful, very humiliating, and very, very dark history of imperialist aggression. What we're seeing today with this sort of increasing U.S. aggressions on this so-called new Cold War is something that has a historical legacy already. Maybe I'll just end this question, is that I just very recently had a chance to go to Okinawa as part of a small trip with some people from Tricontinental Asia to get understanding of firsthand of what does U.S. militarism look like in this region that is becoming, I think, increasingly militarized. I mean, U.S. has now put more bases in the Philippines after 30 years of not creating new bases. We're seeing new bases being built in Okinawa, which is already one of the most occupied areas of the world. It has 0.6% of the Japanese territory, but 70% of the U.S. bases. There were communities that I visited that 80% of the territory was a base. I mean, calling it a base is actually a misnomer. It's actually a military occupation of entire society, and they're increasing. You'll see places that they openly are just like, here are the missiles, and they're all aimed at China. So I think we should be very, very clear about where military aggression is, and that, of course, even as we're seeing this sort of violent aggressions against Latin America and the Caribbean, the ultimate aim is really about containing China, and we have to be very, very alert to oppose U.S. militarism wherever it exists around the world.
Great, thanks. So China has achieved that no socialist project has before, and that also means that there's no roadmap for the way forward. And what do you see as the genuinely open questions?
Oof, so many. I mean, I think one of the things is that, of course, there's many achievements that people can see in China, not just convincing the Chinese people themselves, but I think the world can see, whether it's technological, whether it's a question of, how do you eradicate extreme poverty in a country so large? This is a pressing question of our time, not only in the global South, increasingly in the global North as well. But that being said, I think one of the really open questions is that, yes, in this heightened hyper-imperialist phase that we're living in, how does China continue to be able to chart its path to, advance in its own development? Is still much needed. When we say China is a developing country, let us not be fooled by saying that, because Shanghai has skyscrapers that looks like, a global North city, it means that China is not still a developing country. In the rural areas or the central Western areas, where despite huge improvements, there's so much that needs to be done to sort of consolidate, to advance those gains that have been made over the last 7 decades or so. And so I think that question now, this really big focus of the government on new quality productive forces, I think it links back to when we're talking about coming out of this growth at all costs period into a period where, thinking about green energy, AI, biotechnology, these kinds of areas that are very important for China's increasing development are going to be key. But this is happening when the country is actually under a siege. There is already, it's not a hot war, but there's already all aspects of kind of hybrid warfare, whether it's, through tariffs, through sanctioning, through, deliberate cutting of sort of supply chains. So how do you continue to chart a path to consolidate this socialist construction, to increase the quality of life of the people, to advance on these key sectors of new quality production, at the same time be able to defend, the nation in a situation where we're going to see much more U.S. sort of military and other kinds of aggressions. And I think that's important. I think there's also many things domestically that are still, questions such as, housing prices, to questions about education, youth unemployment. I think one of the things that we've seen in the last 12 years, especially under Xi Jinping, a kind of leftward correction. We were talking about this sort of corrective paths, that addressed many of these kinds of contradictions, especially that accumulated from the reform period. That being said, there's still many things that still need to be addressed on those, especially those larger social questions. And I think that's going to be a big thing we're going to continuously confront. Let me see. I'm not sure. I think those are the two things that I can think about for that question right now.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that's fantastic interview. Thanks so much, Tings, for explaining these things to us. And thanks again for joining.
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam, and to everyone at the US. It was a pleasure to be here.
That's great. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.